My name is Sabrina. I am reporting on behalf of Chinese American media and North American headlines today. And today we have the pleasure of talking to you about your work. So I wanted to start off with your book. So you published a book in 2009 called Massacred for Gold, The Chinese in Hell's Canyon. And you kind of detail the discovery of the murder of 34 Chinese gold miners, which is, astonishing and horrific event in and of itself. But what's even more astonishing is the fact that this history remained hidden for so long until you sort of uncovered it in your book. And I wanted to take this opportunity to, let more people in the Chinese-speaking community, more of our readers, know about your book. So could you just briefly discuss your research journey and how it eventually led to the establishment of the Chinese Massacre Cove and things surrounding like that first?
Okay, I'll try not to talk too long here, but I was born and raised in Oregon, in Portland, but I spent much of my career on the East Coast with the Associated Press. And I came back to Oregon in, I guess, about 1989, and I was touring the state because I hadn't been here for a long, long time. And I was taking a jet boat ride in the Snake River, which is between Idaho and Oregon. And the jet boat operator pointed to a place on the Oregon shore and said, a lot of Chinese were massacred at this site. And I didn't think much more about it, but I kind of put it in the back of my head. There's a story there that I hadn't heard about. And then later on, I learned that a ancestor of one of the people who would be being later involved in the massacre had sent some documents to the Oregon Historical Society that told of this massacre. So I put two and two together and realized that is the same massacre. And nobody really knew about it. So I wrote a story that appeared in the Oregon Historical Quarterly. And several people picked that up and thought that was pretty interesting. The Oregon or the US Geographic Names Board named the site for Chinese Massacre Cove to honor the Chinese. And from that, then I wrote a book. There seemed to be enough interest in the story, and Oregon State University Press published it, and we were off and running. It's been it sold a lot of copies for a nonfiction academic book, and I've been very pleased at the reaction I've had from the Chinese American community as well as the Caucasian community.
Amazing. And sort of following up on that, do you intend to have the book eventually translated into Chinese? And related to that, what do you think this book might mean for the newer generations of Chinese Americans who may not be aware of the history of earlier migrants?
Well, I would love to have it translated into Chinese. It's not my part to do that. The title to the book is held by Oregon State University Press, and it would take some money to have it translated. A number of people have approached me from the Chinese American community about translating it, and I've referred them to the editor at Oregon State, and nothing has happened yet, but it would be wonderful if it is. And the second part of your question, remind me?
Yeah. So what do you think this book might mean, or this history might mean for the newer generations of Chinese Americans who may have immigrated after the events of the massacre, or who just simply may not be aware of this history?
I hope it will be important. I was surprised when I wrote this story that the Chinese American community here in Portland, which is a pretty large community, represented by a Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association, didn't know the story. And I suddenly realized that the Chinese people today didn't know this. They hadn't heard of this story. And so it's been very important, I think, in educating young Chinese here as to what their circumstances were in the early settlement of the country. And of course, the Chinese who we're talking about, those who were massacred at the time, the immigrants who came and built the railroads and mined the gold and cleared the land, they were primarily a bachelor society. They most probably did not intend to live in the United States and had wanted to return to China, and many of them did return to China. Many of them did very well here. Others did not do so well, obviously. But that history seems to have been largely unknown to so many Chinese today, which is a different group of Chinese, as you know, people who immigrated for education and to move into a middle class type of life.
Absolutely, yeah. So I also wanted to ask you a little bit about your career as a journalist. So you've been a journalist for over 40 years. You've spent 25 years with Associated Press, 15 years with the Oregonian in Portland. And throughout the course of career, you have witnessed, these major significant diplomatic events between the United States and China. And so we are currently about like 48 years out since President Nixon visited China. And, given everything that's been going on right now, it kind of ironically feels as if we're on the brink of another Cold War, maybe between the US and China. And I wanted to ask, given your extensive experience with journalism, with all these diplomatic contexts, how are you currently understanding US and China relations?
Well, it's tense. I can't believe it will actually cause to a breakup between the two countries because there's too much at stake for both countries, a great deal of trade and a great deal of friendship between the peoples. But it's used as a tool, I think, by leaders of both countries for their own political points. I don't know a lot about the Chinese government and how they view it. It seems that they are adversarial. There is obviously they're insisting on moving into the south, the China Sea region in Southeast China or Southeast Asia, and the United States is opposed to that. The bases the Chinese are building are seen as a provocation, but it is a long way from the United States, and I don't really see how the United States, given the current strength of China today, I don't really see how the United States can roll back the things that China is doing. Like I say, China has more influence in this region. The United States has sacrificed a lot of the influence that it once had for a lot of different reasons. So I think over time, probably the Chinese authority in the Southeast Asia region will continue to grow, and the United States will have a difficulty time asserting its influence in places like the Philippines and Vietnam and Malaysia and those other countries.
Got it. Thank you so much. And yeah, so we spoke briefly about how you were with the Portland newspaper, and as we know, sort of in the current moment, Portland has been receiving national and global attention since the murder of George Floyd earlier this summer, and the resulting nationwide protests for Black Lives Matter. And Portland has especially been receiving a lot of attention because, with regard to the more violent protests and the state police involvement. So as someone who is native to Oregon, native to Portland, how have you personally been grappling with the ongoing protests? And what do you think made Oregon, in particular, such a fraught site for the Black Lives Matter movement?
I wish I could answer those questions knowledgeably, but I can't, but I can only guess. One, I think what is going on today, the violence in the city, which is now over almost 6 months, maybe not quite that long, but close to it. I think what is going on in Portland now, which we've had months and months of demonstrations and many of them violent, have little to do with the African-American community. Portland, as you may know, is one of the whitest populations of any large city in the country. There aren't many African-Americans here. And the local NAACP, which is one of the organizations that represents Blacks, is opposed to what's been going on in the streets. So I think, my personal opinion is that white radicals in the community are using this for their own purposes, which seems to be just street mayhem and violence. It is so sad to me to go downtown Portland, see it somewhat deserted, to see many stores boarded up. And my goodness, just this last week, there was a riot in downtown Portland in the park blocks, and they tore down a statue of Abraham Lincoln. that has not much to do with Black Lives Matter. Abraham Lincoln should be a hero, and is, to the Black community. Also tore down statues of an elk, of all things, of pioneers, of Teddy Roosevelt. And so I think it's just a radical element has decided to seize on Portland. Now, Portland has a history of radicalism too. There used to be a labor movement here called the International Workers of the World, called the Wobblies. And they were a radical leftist movement, and they were pretty popular in this region. The region has never been very welcome to Blacks. The Ku Klux Klan was quite active here in the 20s. And so the tradition of being hostile to the Blacks is rather deep-seated, although today it's much better for the community that exists here. So that's a bit of a rambling around. I'm very sad, even shocked, by what has gone on in the city. It's not the city I grew up in that sense. It's a beautiful city, and to see it trashed, and so much so that people are afraid to go downtown for good reason, is very sad to me. I guess that's kind of the explanation I would give you off the top of my head without being very authoritative about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you have any thoughts to share on specifically the government reaction, sort of like state police intervention in trying to, I don't know if resolve is the right word, but intervene in the conflict at the local, state, federal levels?
I think there is really a terrible lack of leadership at the top. I'm hardly a conservative. I'm not a conservative, but I think the leadership in Portland and the mayor's office and the city council has been terribly ineffective. They really don't know what to do. And some days they seem to side with the demonstrators, and then there's a violent outburst, and then they kind of denounce that, and then it's going, yeah, but, and they try to explain why it might have happened. And so they really haven't taken any authoritative stand on it that I've seen. So I think that's part of the problem, that people are taking advantage of a very weak government. I think police are handicapped because they've had a little support in the community. Sure, there have been police abuses in Portland, as there have been elsewhere. There's always kind of a bad group of police. But for the most part, I think it's an excellent force. And I don't think they've had a lot of support from the media, from the newspapers, from the community. So it must be very difficult to be a policeman in Portland these days and see how little support that they are getting. They seem to be much criticized, almost everything that they do. Can't use tear gas, can't do this, you have to be very careful. And yet they're asked to control the situation, but they're not really given the tools to do it. So again, I go back to your question, I think it's a problem of poor leadership. I don't have anything against the mayor or the members of the city council or the governor. And I can understand the federal government wanting to do more here, but they're resisted by the community. They don't want the government coming in. Outside Portland, neighboring police agencies haven't wanted to get involved because they feel that the city is not, or the police force hasn't received its own support, so they haven't wanted to come to its aid. I don't know if that helps, but that's my random response to your question. Very difficult question.
Absolutely, yeah. So I guess sort of on the topic of leadership, as I'm sure you very well know, we are sort of in the midst of a very fraught few weeks leading up to a very consequential election this November. And I was wondering, so how has your research and how has your experience as a journalist, informed your voting decision or your predictions about the upcoming election, or even just how you're processing this upcoming election? And do you feel hopeful at all? How are you feeling right now?
It would be terrible if I wasn't hopeful, so I am hopeful. I'm not going to tell you who I would vote for, but let me just say that I'm appalled at the policies of the current government. The isolationism, you're kind of withdrawing from the world, which I happen to think is a mistake. The it just doesn't seem to be any firm direction on the part of the government in a meaningful way. It's almost like they want to exploit the violence, exploit the differences, be more divisive in their policies. And I'm very hopeful that a new government will come to power, which will be more unifying, and so we can be proud of the country again. I'm sympathetic with the Black, you haven't asked this question, but it's kind of lurking in the background. I'm sympathetic to the Black Lives Movement in the respect that I appreciate and what African Americans have gone through in this country. And they've been we've too long ignored the part of our history dealing with slavery. And I personally have written a number of books on Western history, many of which focus on slavery and the treatment of Blacks in the West. And so I have no problem with trying to provide a more just life for people who have been mistreated, throughout history. But I don't extend that into demonstrations in the streets. And I think it can be and should be peacefully done.
I see. Thank you. Yeah, so sort of continuing on sort of the elections and everything that's been going on, you've clearly done a lot of research and writing about your local communities, especially, Chinese Americans and other communities of color in Oregon. What consequences do you think that Chinese Americans and other people of color in this country might face depending on the outcome of the election?
I think it's different. You can speak to this better than I do, but Chinese Americans who have suffered a great deal of discrimination earlier in our history are not, I think, doing very well in the community, and in the sense, at least in Oregon and the West, that are very well accepted. They contribute greatly to the community in politics and business and culture, and to my mind, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, are well integrated in the community and a very important part of the leadership of the communities that I'm familiar with. It hasn't been the case so much with other groups. I don't, my Chinese American friends don't talk a lot of politics to me. So I don't really know and I don't ask either, so I don't know what their attitudes are toward the current election. I think there is probably some historical suspicion that exists between the African American and Chinese American communities. I don't know that for a fact. It's just kind of a sense that they're not united in terms of what they want, in this country. And Chinese Americans have moved ahead very, very well, and African Americans not so well. And of course, they have different origins in their background in this community. I'm rambling a bit, and probably have not fully answered the outcome of the election for the Chinese American community. I think they probably would benefit, like the rest of Americans of all races, from a more unified country than we've had in the last 4 years. It just seems to me that the country can grow together if it is together, and by being divisive, that everybody loses out to some degree.
I see. Thank you. Last question about the election. So in these conversations leading up to, deciding the next president of the United States, a lot of people are saying and believe that, Trump's policies for the past 4 years have boosted the American economy, and feel that like the stock markets have proved that. And so that we should give him credit for his policies on tax, employment, trade, and also his efforts on leaving international treaties. How do you perceive these policies, and do you believe that such policies bring economic benefit to American people in the long run?
Again, hard to say. I covered economics for the Associated Press when I was in Washington, D.C. for a few years. And at that time, people were very concerned about inflation. And I just don't know now, nobody seems to be concerned about pumping these billions and billions of dollars into the community, which is basically just creating money. And but nobody's talking about that. People say the community needs it, but I can't believe it's going to go on indefinitely without some consequences. I think Trump has probably been very good for, let's call the wealthy class. We don't like to, in the United States, don't like to talk about classes, but indeed there are classes there. And there's a very wealthy class, and I think they have done very well. There was a tax cut early in the Trump administration, which really cut taxes for higher income people. I think lower income people have suffered a great deal. I know there's just a story yesterday on the number of people who've gone into poverty. You know, that's gone up a lot. And when there is high unemployment, that, you know, poverty comes along with that, because the high unemployment usually affects the lower income groups, you know, primarily first of all. And the stock market reflects I think what is happening in the upper classes. The fact that there are a lot of money is being made by a lot of people, and a lot of those are the people who primarily have the stocks, and so they're doing very well. There may be also some speculation built into it too, because I just can't believe that we can just keep pumping money into the system without any unrelated to creating any value along with it. And I'm amazed nobody ever talks about the danger of inflation, but it's going to be there someday, I'm sure. Overall, though, I don't know how Biden, let's talk about Biden, can really straighten things out. He talks about raising taxes on the upper classes, and maybe he can do that, but that's just one person. You have to bring the Congress, the Senate, and the House along on that. And raising taxes after you've lowered taxes is not an easy thing to do. So overall, I think Trump has been good for the wealthier classes of the country, and I think he's been terrible for the poorer classes of the country. I don't know how it is in Massachusetts, but I do know in the streets of Portland, even before these demonstrations, you drive around, and this once beautiful city, still a beautiful city, and there are tents everywhere for the homeless. I mean, literally everywhere, around freeway entrances, downtown streets, parks, and that is new. That was not there 10, 15, 20 years ago. I know it's the same in Seattle. I know it's the same in San Francisco. I know it's the same in Los Angeles. A huge number of homeless, getting worse, people living on the streets. And that is also a reflection, I think, of the Trump economy.
I see. Okay. Thank you so much. So I wanted to close out with one last question. And I want to, just like go back to the research you've done for your book, or like your sort of like journalistic pursuits between US and China. And I wanted to just ask if you could share any fond memories you had of like while doing research for your book or during your visits to China as a journalist.
I made 3 visits to China over the years, all of them just very pleasurable. I think the first one was in get my years right here, 1979. I'm an older guy. So I went there with a Jimmy Carter's Treasury Secretary named Mike Blumenthal. And we did a tour of Shanghai and Xi'an and Beijing and saw the Great Wall and did the sights. Mike Blumenthal had lived there during the war. He was a German Jew, and China was one of the few places that had been receptive to taking in the Jews during World War II, which is really wonderful that this happened. And so Mike Blumenthal was one of these people who grew up in China, and he had fond memories of the country. And we visited many of the places that he knew. And that was a memorable trip for me, my first trip to China. I went back in 1984 again with Treasury Secretary George Shultz, and sort of a fact-finding trip. And then I went again with Ronald Reagan in 1985. Again, a marvelous trip. I can still remember being up on the Great Wall of China with a telephone, talking to my office in Washington, D.C. Amazing. That was amazing technology at the time. Now you just be on a cell phone, it'd be no big deal. But each time that I went to China, I noticed the changes. The first time I was in China, we stayed at a hotel in Beijing called the Jinshu Hotel. I think it was kind of a workers' hotel in the very near Tiananmen Square. And I remember waking up in the morning, that first morning, the tinkling of bells. And I looked out the window and the street was just filled with bicycles. You know, people dressed in their blue smocks or brown smock clothing and riding bikes. And the next time I went back, more cars. And then 1985, more cars still. I don't know if people still in China still ride bikes or not, but the change has just been dramatic in China. Very impressive, at least in the cities. Now, I've not been out in the countryside much to see how people live in the countryside. And I suppose like in other countries, you know, it's much different between the progress in cities and the progress, you know, in the countryside. So those are some of the memories that I have of China, and they're dear, dear memories. I've loved the things I've been able to purchase, souvenirs, and bring them back from China. And fond memory. That was a highlight of my career, were visits to China in that period of time.
Yeah, yeah. And sort of like, you know, like beyond like the sights you saw and, you know, like the wonderful memories you had on the Great Wall, who were you able to talk to and connect with during your visits?
Primarily the American side. They did, we were pretty much, minders were kind of with us all the time. I did, you know, wander with my colleagues, you know, through the streets of Beijing and visited in shops, but there was usually somebody kind of keeping an eye on us. And we would talk to shopkeepers and with a translator, and they're very cautious in the things that they said. So I can't say that we really engaged much with the Chinese people in terms of any sort of a heart-to-heart discussion, but people were always very polite and receptive to us. And of course, they all kind of knew the government was watching us all the time. We were very, very aware of that, you know, in those periods of time. But I found people very, very receptive. I remember one time there were 4 of us. This was probably, again, on maybe the second trip with George Schultz. We were wandering in Beijing. We decided we wanted to have lunch. And so we went into this restaurant. It was like a cafeteria, kind of people, workers sitting at long tables, having rice, eating rice or fish out of the bowls. And so we took one of the tables. There's 4 of us, and the manager or the owner of the shop came running over. No, 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 we'll take you to a better room. And so he took us up 2 flights of stairs to a 3rd floor banquet room. We're all by ourselves up there around a large table with tapestries on the walls and nice carpets. And they delivered like a huge lunch we couldn't eat. You know, there's so much of the food. It was absolutely delicious with ivory chopsticks, you know, and a sort of, I mean, they didn't want us to sit with a common man. They wanted to show us, you know, a better side of China. But I also suspected that there was a minder there who said, no, no, keep them, you know, give them a nice place upstairs. And so that's what we did. But all these things are kind of fond memories. I enjoyed the visits tremendously. I would love to go back, although I probably won't, because I know since I was last there, there's been so much more progress. Those cities have grown so much. You know, it's incredible.
Yeah, yeah, and sort of like speaking on the progress that you said you noticed during each recurring visit back to China, I was wondering, you know, as someone who has been working, you know, at the intersection of economics and foreign policy as a journalist, you know, amidst all these like observations about like urban progress and stuff in China, how do you predict like sort of like the future of US-China trade in this, you know, very increasingly globalized economy?
Because it is increasingly globalized, as you say, I see it continuing to grow. There's going to be fits and starts and blips and disappointments and many crises all along the way, but I see it continuing. The countries are too intertwined in their economies. I think the growth of the Chinese economy has kind of taken the breath away in many people in this country. Is growing so much. And of course, the United States has helped to fuel that growth through all the trade deficits that they've had over the years. I can recall, some years ago in Washington, there was one of the economists was saying, wow, these deficits, all this trade deficits are fueling a lot of growth in China, which we may regret someday. And I think indeed we may regret it someday, but still it's a huge deficit in China's favor. I just think the economies are so intertwined that if the militaries can keep under control, that there's probably going to just be continued closer growth. I think the friendship between the two peoples, I can just speak of my admiration and for the Chinese people as both in China and Chinese Americans here. It's just I just think it's a great relationship, and I'm hoping that will help to sustain the continuing friendship between the two countries.
Thank you very much. So that is all the questions that I have on my end. If you'd have anything else you'd like to share in particular with our readers, I'd be happy to give you the floor, but otherwise, that's all on my end.
Well, let me say, going back to a question I think you asked, and I'm not sure I answered it very well about optimism. Yes, I'm optimistic about the future of this country. I think Americans, generally speaking, Americans of all races, are well-meaning people. And again, I don't quite understand what all is happening in Portland, which is generally been a very nice town, but I am assuming the answers will be found, and we will find a better leadership, and cooler heads will prevail, and maybe a change in Washington and on November 3rd after the election, which will be much more able to heal the divisions that are occurring in the country right now and bringing people together. So I guess I would just like to say that I would leave you with a message of hope, Sabrina. But I will also say I really have appreciated your questions. Your questions have been great. They've been very thoughtful, and I hope I've been helpful. I know I've rambled in much of my responses, but it's been fun talking to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. Thank you so much for sharing your time. I hope we'll be able to get the word out about your book to a lot of our readers, and I wish you all the best. I hope you stay healthy.
Well, thank you.